How's it going, Russell? It's great to finally get you on the podcast. I feel like we've been planning this thing for, what seems like at least 6, 7 months now at this point.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Glad to be here. Glad we could make it happen. And yeah, excited to have a conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Russell, why don't we start with what interested you in IT or security that brought you down this path, right? Um, I start everyone off there, not only to hear your story, but there's also a lot of people that are listening to this podcast that maybe want to get into IT or maybe want to get into security, and maybe they're doing a career change or they don't really know how to do that, right? And I feel like it's always helpful for people to hear someone else's story, and maybe they can relate to your story and hear like, hey, if this guy did it, maybe it's possible for me, and that's that little spark that some people need. So, what's your background with that?
Well, I'd be flattered to hear if I'm inspiring anyone in that way, but regardless, I always feel like I draw from like a personal curiosity and interest, and I think that anybody should follow that to whatever degree, and if it's IT or technology in general, definitely foster that in any way you can. So I was introduced to computers at a young age through my father, who had a job in telecommunications, and I think he was personally interested in the personal computer and the evolution of processor and memory and applications. He was not into software. He wasn't writing software, but kind of a tinkerer, craftsman at heart, and hobbyist, which I think I inherited largely. And I think my first foray into IT was networking between systems on a local area network for the purposes of multiplayer gaming. So I recall trying to connect two computers to play games like Doom or Doom 2, right? And I remember this moment where I played this game and you could see another character in the game, right? So normally you're playing this first person, all you see is your character's kind of like field of view, right? And the other characters are all procedural or not procedural at the time, part of the game's software, but not other people playing, right? And that moment of multiplayer gaming with a friend in the same room but on a different computer kind of just really ignited the passion for technology for me overall. And so that evolved to learning more about networking, learning more about software and computers in general. And fast forward, let's say five-ish years, I was trying to write web pages for people to make money, and I had a kind of early entrepreneurial spirit, I'll say, right? So I was mowing lawns and washing cars, but also writing HTML and JavaScript and stuff for folks to make money. And fast forward another few years, I'm working for a large, let's say like Fortune 500 company as an IT support person or a application support person. So I had managed to find a career or a job, full-time job doing that, focusing on networking and application support. And my first introduction into security as a profession was after that in deep network or deep packet inspection and intrusion detection, and in a security operations center. So, I think to go back to your question again, I would suggest that you just follow your own interest and curiosity. Like, why are you curious or interested in IT, right? Is there a particular technology? And follow that thread as far as you can, because if you're happy and you're interested in, and you're doing what you like, you can probably find a way to make money doing it, right?
Yeah, it's a good point. And it sounds like your background is actually pretty similar to my own. Right. One of the earliest memories I have with my dad is actually sitting on his lap and I'm just like typing on the keyboard, not typing, I'm just pushing buttons. But
Yeah.
like that was, it was a lot of fun for me to do that. And like I see something come up on the screen and it's like, oh, I'm doing something.
Yeah.
And same thing, like he had a career in telecom, and computers was more of a hobby that he was trying to learn and figure out and whatnot. And it's really interesting, and thinking back as well. I always had a bit of a entrepreneurial spirit, right? I was kind of always trying to look for creative ways of making money and taking myself like to that next level. And when I got to college, I actually didn't even study computers. I thought IT was extremely boring. I thought, to myself, like if I'm stuck at a desk, every single day for my whole career, like that sounds like a miserable, career. It sounds like a miserable existence. I hope that never happens, and here I am like in security and I love it. It's like how the tables have turned on me. But right before you got that first job, did you go to college? Did you study computers at all?
Yeah. So I went to school for business initially to follow that kind of more general entrepreneurial avenue. And I planned on using kind of my experience kind of as a freelance IT web developer, software developer to kind of sustain that, but not to necessarily take it into a career. And I dropped out of school when I realized that I could probably do that full time. And I first focused on Linux administration, actually, primarily on Red Hat and an RHCSA certification. But I was writing software in Python, and basically, at some point, I just did some mental math on how much money I could make this year versus spend on college, and I haven't gone to school since. I often think about what I would study if I went back to school, and I don't think it would be a computer science degree to this day, right? I think it might be nursing or something, just something that would be really interesting to learn. I think that there's one of the interesting things about the security industry is the kind of the heterogeneous nature of folks' background that are in it, right? So you have folks who are computer science, but a lot of folks come in from different angles to make security or the industry their career. Now, there's obviously lots of different focus areas, right? And I think that one of the challenges with security is actually developing a sane curriculum within time for it to be relevant, right? So this is largely a problem with academia in general, but I think it's just much more difficult with technology to develop a curriculum that makes sense for someone going out into the workforce, right? And so that hands-on experience is just so much more relevant, but also valuable to folks. And now I'm largely part of my role today is hiring. So I'm looking at I'm looking at it through a different lens, trying to find the best people to help solve certain problems. And I do look at academic history in some degree, but it's certainly not something that can be looked at in a vacuum. I think you your personal experience, motivation, intelligence, and other things, like apart from just a degree, is really what we're looking for. And I would just say that hands-on experience and a passion for the problem is just so much more valuable than some certificate or degree. Though I do certainly appreciate the first principles and the pursuit of academic excellence, right? We're obviously standing on a lot of shoulders that came from that, right?
Yeah, it's a balance. I take it from the approach of, let's check as many boxes as I possibly can to get through, HR, right? Because, this is the thing, right? Like the hiring manager, yeah, they weigh the degree and certifications and experience properly, right? Where experience matters a whole lot. The certifications kind of, solidify that or say like, yeah, he does probably have this experience. And the same thing with the degree to some extent, depending on where you go and the program and all that sort of stuff, right? But it's about getting through that HR screening, that probably doesn't exist at smaller companies. But for the majority of companies, you still have to get through like that checkbox, and so I always recommend that people kind of take a broad approach to this. It's not one, for sure method of getting yourself in the door. It's really more about you being passionate and you diving in and you kind of becoming more well-rounded on paper, at least on paper. And of course having those technical skills to back it up to really be successful and get in the door and get that job.
Yeah. I feel like I kind of breeze past where I might normally kind of say what I'm up to now and kind of qualify my opinion. So first of all, like,
oh yeah,
I founded a company a few years ago. We're called Viso Trust. We're in the security industry. We focus on third-party risk management, and we're essentially bringing artificial intelligence and natural language processing into a product or platform that aims to help businesses understand the risk of doing business with one another. And we primarily look at the language within artifacts or documents, websites, to derive information about the strength of a business's security program and whether or not it's been attested in high assurance or third-party audits, other places that might be relevant, and get people out of the business of reading questionnaires and SOC 2 reports. And founding that company, I think, is kind of right along the same trajectory of entrepreneurial, spirit, and also, if you start a company, you don't necessarily have to go through HR. So it might be, one of the only options in some cases, right, for me. But I found it to be very rewarding. Now we have, a bunch of customers. We have an amazing team. And in the age of large language models and generative AI, I feel like we're very fortunate. There's definitely a degree of luck here, being in the position that we are now, trying to solve this problem with the technology that really makes a lot of sense doing it.
When did you start the company?
So Paul and I, as co-founders, technically created a business entity and filed for patents for the network and the system of interacting with businesses, deriving risk, exchanging data, in 2016. And we left our kind of full-time jobs in 2020 to kind of dedicate full time to the product and the company. So depending on how you look at it, we founded the company in 2016, but went to work, so to speak, at the company in 2020.
Yeah, I asked that, because LLMs and AI, it's everywhere now.
Yeah.
And so it's really easy for people to kind of hop on that bandwagon, right? But you forming it in 2016 shows that you had that, that innovative idea long before people were really thinking about AI or LLMs and how it will impact their lives or anything like that.
Yeah.
And I think you're approaching this from like a kind of a common sense approach almost, right? Maybe the worst part of my job is dealing with compliance standards
Right.
and trying to identify risk of third parties and stuff like that. Like it's just terrible. I don't want to do that, but
Yeah.
it's a part of it. I have to do it. I have to deal with it. And it sounds like, you're approaching that from a new area, a new way, with involving this cutting edge technology that's able to assist us in actually getting through it in a much more efficient way.
Yeah. So the idea evolved from personal experience, and Paul and I's kind of mandate at a company we were working at to essentially get a grip on third party risk, and being technical. We were addressing kind of like a largely people and process problem at the time. It still remains that way in a lot of organizations, but you have your questionnaire, and you have a process of sending that to your third parties and then waiting for them to answer it and then making sense of that answer or collection of answers. But also, like you mentioned, the compliance problem of, at the time, there were less, but still many, many different compliance frameworks that people might adhere to in some way, or have a certificate or some artifact to prove that they did adhere to it. So the job was sending emails, reading questionnaires, reading compliance reports, right? And workflow around sending emails is a problem that can be solved with kind of existing web application technology very easily. But reading documents and understanding language, referencing material from some corpus of known industry frameworks, mapping that to an assurance level and having it culminate into a risk assessment, that seemed to be rather novel. But in particular, the affordance of natural language processing was clear at that time. And I feel like the technology has kind of evolved, obviously, since all you need is attention, or the papers that support it, and then informed things like generative pre-trained transformer models. But at the time, I was dealing with anomaly detection and machine learning models in the security operations center sense. So tell me, you have this gigantic amount of data, network traffic data. Tell me if something is different that might be interesting for me to look at, not just that matches some heuristic rule, right? And the promise of machine learning back then was still largely that unrealized in a business application, right? And for that reason, a lot of people looked at it like snake oil. And in 2020, even when we founded the company, a lot of people were skeptical about machine learning and artificial intelligence ability to predict or help with this process. And I think, fast forward to today, it's amazing. People are like, well, of course you use machine learning to query and return insights from unstructured language, right? It's like almost business imperative to adopt this technology in those use cases, right? And so I think we're well positioned to take advantage of the core technology that we have already. On top of that, but yeah, it's been our philosophy since day one that it is at its core a natural language process problem. So making sense of language very quickly is the primary kind of task as a third-party risk professional. Looking at a compliance report, what is the standard? And tell me whether this document is better than another, or it substantiates the existence of a mature security program differently than another. And machine learning and large language models now are very well suited to help with that.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area. You know, I was actually thinking about this just the other day of how complex, you know, English is as a language, and then, you know, how much more complex, you know, Mandarin is, and Russian, and all of those sorts of languages. And I think about that because I remember when I was going through school, you know, I took Spanish a couple of years in high school, and then I also took a few semesters of it in college. And by the time I got to college doing Spanish, I absolutely hated Spanish. I just the sentence structure just didn't make much sense to me. I think I was a bit burnt out on it, to be honest. And so I switched it up and I went with German, not because I thought that it would be, you know, easier in any way or anything like that. I just needed something different. And German made a whole lot more sense to me because, you know, you have the exact same sentence structure in German as you do in English, because English is a Germanic language.
Right.
And so that whole part of it made a lot of sense to me. And the fact that you could have, you know, an entire sentence in a block of like 26 characters that looks like one word, and then learning how to be like, oh no, there's like 5 words in that thing, you know, and it's just pronounced this way, right? Learning that was a lot more fun and easier for me. But, you know, looking back and looking at the different languages, they're all unique. They're all very different and complex in their own ways. And so I think it'll be really interesting to see, you know, where a solution like this will go. Really anything that has to look at language and make an assessment, where it'll go once you start venturing out into other languages. You know, like, what's that learning curve like? What is, what's the different sources that it has to pull from to actually learn what it needs to learn? Have you explored that at all, or are you still trying to kind of master the English side of it?
Well, I think you know, similar to kind of other problems, it's helpful to kind of abstract and maybe identify a reasonable, like, single language, so to speak. So in a lot of ways, you know, like mathematical notation might be, you know, recognized across different languages. The product, and I think the way that we address this space is to use technologies that are strong at translating other languages to a common language that the product can then interpret. And so for that reason, what we do is we translate from foreign languages into English always. And then we provide, you know, substantiation of controls through that. So we rely on the accuracy of translation, you know, translation models, and our ability to translate to English correctly first, right? But that a similar problem exists around control frameworks and compliance, right? There really is no unique security question or control outside of the ones that are being, you know, added let's say for machine learning or artificial intelligence risk now, it's very uncommon to see a question that hasn't been asked before, right? They're all just slightly different. They all relate to the same control, though, or set of controls. And so what we do is we translate to a risk model that recognizes those controls, but then appreciates that they might exist as a control within different frameworks as well, and allow you to understand, okay, this is the AICPA trust services criteria for background checks, whatever the ID is, but it also maps to the ISO 27001 control for background checks, and NIST and CSA or whatever all the other frameworks are, right? But again, similar to how we translate to English, we look for that control itself rather than some specific instance of that in a language or something, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. That it probably cuts it down, significantly of the learning period that you have to have with that.
Yeah.
That's really fascinating on, how it works and everything.
I also focused on German as my foreign language in school for similar reasons. Finding that it was just easier to learn given its similar kind of structure, right? I certainly appreciate that.
Yeah. I going into it, I thought it was going to be a lot more difficult than it actually was. But I love going to Germany. Have you ever been to Germany?
I have not. No. No. I'd love to. I haven't been to Europe actually.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been to Germany too many times. I need to go to other places. I think this year I'm forcing myself to go to London, and I'm using the Bears game as an excuse to go to London. So it's like, see, like the Bears are going. I have to go support the team.
Yeah. That's one thing about Chicago that I really miss is the strong kind of identity and culture of like appreciation of Chicago that was just so obvious everywhere you went. Obviously, if it's hard to live in Chicago, so if you do live there, it's probably for good reason, right? And you like it. But the sports fandom, I think, remains kind of unparalleled in a lot of ways. So, are you a fan of other Chicago teams besides the Bears?
Oh yeah, pretty much all of them. Yeah, Bears, Bulls, Blackhawks. My wife converted me several years ago from a Sox fan to a Cubs fan. Really, just about all of them. Wow. And I go to a lot of games a year. I've kind of put a hold on it since I got a 10-month-old.
Yeah,
I want to have too much fun without the wife because then she'll get a little jealous and whatnot. Yeah. But I love the sports. It's it's interesting, right? Because my generation, we grew up with one of the greatest dynasties in basketball ever, right? So we kind of grew up being used to that like level of performance, and we, grew up with our baseball teams just basically forever being terrible. Not even like close to being competitive, and then we get like these 1 or 2 years tied together where it's like, oh, we're the best, and so it's always interesting being a Chicago sports fan, especially like for the Bears. Like the Bears is just the most frustrating, topic for me because it's just like we could be so much better if we just had a different owner. At this point we've changed out all the other pieces. We need to change out that owner and see what we can actually do.
Have
you been into sports, or what's your sports city if you have one?
I feel like I appreciate an amazing game, an amazing team overall, and so I find myself kind of enjoying all sports. I was and remain kind of a pretty big Blackhawks fan. During the time that I lived in Chicago, was kind of the same time that they were doing really well. The kind of the age of Kane and Taves and their streak. I grew up playing all sorts of sports, but mostly played tennis. And ironically, I don't really follow tennis that much, but I think like I love watching hockey. I love watching, any game that's like competitive, and I love seeing like, the human kind of performance, the pinnacle of any kind of like hard work from an individual, the dedication, right? I mean, to think about how much work goes into becoming a professional athlete overall. So I'll watch someone doing the mile sprint, or playing table tennis or whatever, and I'm just fascinated by human accomplishment like that. But nothing beats a good Chelsea Dagger goal celebration in the United Center. So that's still my top.
Those are so much fun. Like I love hockey. And unfortunately, like, well, I guess now it's not unfortunately, but like I try to get into the season, but I don't have a whole lot of time to spare, Yeah. So typically, like right now is when I start to kind of get back into hockey, because football is ending. So that's my, my primary sports fix, right? And the Bulls are terrible.
Mm-hmm.
So now it's like, okay, I can focus more on hockey that I want to be, more into.
Yeah.
And the closest I've ever sat at a Blackhawks game was probably like second row. And I learned real quick, you can't bang on the glass anymore. So that was fantastic. But, it's a great experience in seeing, these guys move around the ice and shoot the puck like that. I mean, the hand-eye coordination that you have to have, the agility, the speed, the strength.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really impressive.
Yeah.
Because, when I grab a hockey stick and I try and, shoot the puck, right? Like it's terrible.
Yeah.
It's going like what, maybe 5 miles an hour on a good day, for me. Like I can't imagine, the amount of hours and practice that they put into it, even just growing up.
Do you have a similar appreciation for, people in the security or the technology kind of space? Like, I think there's you might see somebody and think that looks pretty easy. Like I could shoot the puck like that, or is there kind of like is there an analogous phenomenon like that in IT for you? Yeah,
absolutely. I it's interesting. I haven't tied the two together in that way, but I do have that same reaction. I talk to a lot of people on this podcast. That's probably the biggest benefit of this podcast is networking and talking to so many different people. And, I'm constantly blown away by the expertise of my guests. I was talking to someone a couple weeks ago about quantum computing, quantum security. And they were talking about how, they're using crystals to create this quantum connection and secure communications and things like that, right? And that's a level that I'll probably never reach, and that is something that takes so many hours to get into and to actually like wrap your head around it and figure it out. Like you have to appreciate that kind of work. Mm-hmm. And then I talk to people that hack airplanes while they're on the plane, you know, like that that's a totally different, you know, world than what I want to be on. And, you know, this person goes to DEF CON and it's like, hey, what flight are you on again? So I can make sure I don't book that flight.
Yeah.
You know, like, because if this guy gets a little too bored, he's going to start hacking this airplane, and I don't want to be on that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I feel like that. I feel the same. You know, it's very easy. It's easy to kind of be inspired and then take on a challenge after being inspired, and only to realize that there's a lot of work ahead of you to be, you know, proficient to the same degree as that person, right? Yeah, I feel like my position.
Do you
go ahead?
Oh no, continue. I think you were going to answer my question anyways.
I feel like the startup founder role kind of favors someone who's interested in learning a lot, and is comfortable kind of switching hats, so to speak, and letting go of kind of maybe some pressure that's self-imposed to become the perfect expert at one particular kind of focus area, and finding those people and bringing them together, right, and enabling them. So that, I feel like that's kind of a unique and especially rewarding challenge for me, is like, you know, finding the right people who are smarter than me to solve a problem, right?
Yeah, that is that's the challenging part at that level, is finding the right people. You know, I always hear about like how important that is, especially when you're a small company, you know, because you can't spare the time of training, you know, another new person every 3, 4, 5 months. You need them to be there to actually, you know, build this thing